Hi everyone, we're reading chapter 8 today, which is called Revelations. Once we started going downriver, it was a little easier to stay with the group, even though we zigzagged all over the place. As the hours dragged, Gary and I grew hungrier and hungrier, but even that didn't stop us from trying to rack up points on each other. Hey, Jimmy Jack, Gary called to the canoe up ahead. How many points I get for giving the weasel here my granola bar? Under the circumstances, 10 points, Jimmy Jack shouted. No way, Wall Street called from two canoes over. 2 3/8, max. 8 5/8, Jimmy Jack argued. 5 1/4, and we got a deal. Sold, Jimmy Jack shouted as they both went for their notebooks and jotted down the number. Gary handed up the bar to me, and I took a bite. It was perfect, just what I needed. But I was no fool. Wall Street, I called. How many points I get if I give half of it back to him? 7 even, she offered. 2 1/2, Jimmy Jack countered. 5 and it's a deal. Again, they went for their notebooks. I turned back to Gary and started to hand him the granola bar, and then it happened. Thud. We hit a huge boulder sticking out of the river. Before I could push away with my paddle, the current caught the back of the canoe and started turning us around. To the left, I yelled. Paddle to the left. But it did no good. Before we knew it, we were going down the river sideways. To the left, I kept shouting. To the left. But whatever Gary was doing, he wasn't paddling us to the left. He was paddling us straight toward another boulder. Watch it, I screamed. Scrape, screech. The canoe came to a stop on a large flat rock. We were grounded, but only for a second. The current pushed and tugged until the whole canoe started to tip. Hang on! To the left! Push to the left! You're rocking us. Stop rocking the... Gary, push to the... Look out! And just like that, we were in the water. The freezing water. But it wasn't the cold that we were worried about. Grab the paddles, I shouted. Don't let the paddles get away. We dove after them. My sleeping bag, Gary shouted. Get my sleeping bag. I made a lunge for it, but missed. The current had already picked it up and swept it into the main channel of the river. We watched helplessly as it disappeared out of sight. Oh, man, Gary groaned. My brother's going to kill me. 10 minutes later, we were back in our canoe, shivering up a storm. I talked Gary into letting me sit in the back so I could steer. It cost 3 7/8 points, but it was a small price to pay to keep us going in the right direction. I knew there was something weird about the way Gary steered and paddled. I didn't know how weird until he sat in front of me. Gary, don't you know how to paddle? Of course I do. What do you take me for? He grabbed his paddle tighter and shoved it back into the water, all crooked and cockeyed like. Suddenly, all our zigzagging made sense. Don't get me wrong, I'm no canoe expert, but Gary didn't know beans about paddling. I can't explain it. He held it in his hands all backwards and twisted. A baseball bat, I said. You hold it like a baseball bat. Oh, right, a baseball bat, sure. He fumbled with the paddle a little, but wound up holding it even worse than before. Gary, what now? A baseball bat, I repeated. You've held a baseball bat before. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't. You've never held a baseball bat before? I couldn't hide the amusement in my voice. What type of kid never held a baseball bat? Didn't your dad ever show you how to hold a baseball bat? Yeah, he snorted in contempt. Like I'm sure my old man's going to play baseball with me. I started to answer, but let it go. It was like a new Gary began to appear in front of me. As I kept watching him struggle and fight with the simple little job of paddling, I started, I don't know, kind of feeling sorry for him. Sure, I could have laughed and made fun of him and made all sorts of jokes, but somehow it wasn't funny. Instead, it was kind of sad. I mean, if no one showed him simple stuff like holding a baseball bat, what else didn't they show him? Who knew what this guy's life was really like? Who knew what type of stuff he had to put up with at home? Maybe underneath that tough exterior, there was a tender, sensitive heart that just needed... Listen, he snarled at me from over his shoulder. If you don't start paddling, I'll bash your brains in. I started paddling with all of my might, but I also kept watching. A few hours later, we set up camp with everyone else. Opera and my group cheered me on while Gary's goons did the same for him. We were both scoring points like crazy. You see, we'd figured out that if we let the other guy help us and score some points off of us, then we were actually helping him, which meant we should be scoring even more points for ourselves. Confusing? You bet. Especially when the conversations went like this. Hey, here, Gary, I brought you dinner. I score 5.5 points. I didn't want you to get my dinner. I lose 5.5 points. Please go ahead and take it. I score 5.5 points. Well, all right, Gary sighs, but only if it will help you score. Gary scores 10 points. See what I mean about confusing? And we went around and around like that all night. Everything from getting refills on hot chocolate to untying each other's shoes to slapping off the other guy's mosquitoes. Talk about exhausting. But the last one, the one when we got ready for bed, that's the one I'll never forget. You're still in your wet clothes, I said. You can't sleep in them. Let me get you some dry ones. Don't bother. No bother, I said as I got up and walked over to his duffel bag. I don't need any. Sure you do, I said, picking up the bag. McDougal! But he was too late. I already had the thing unzipped. Inside there was nothing but a couple of pairs of used socks, very used, a worn t-shirt or two, and some cutoffs. Where's the rest of your clothes? I asked. Didn't you bring them? Of course I brought them, he sneered. I just, they're, he faltered for a second. They were in with my sleeping bag. Yeah, they were rolled up inside the sleeping bag that you let float off. Oh, I said, not buying a word of it. Well, you can't sleep in your wet clothes. They're fine, he shrugged. Listen, my mom packed an extra blanket, along with extra everything else in the world. Why don't you use it? I don't need your blanket, he growled. I was stumped. The guy was obviously lying, and he obviously needed a blanket. What could I do? Then a thought came to my mind. A pretty good one. Listen, Gary. I'm a bit behind in the points. You'd be doing me a favor if you let me score by loaning you this blanket. He looked at me for a long moment. Come on, just this once. I'll owe you. Well, all right, he finally muttered. But just this once. Thanks, I grinned. At least I was grinning on the outside. On the inside, I was really starting to hurt for the guy. I mean, he didn't have anybody to teach him sports stuff. He didn't have anybody to pack him decent clothes. What else didn't he have? Later, as everyone lay in bed, I thought I'd find out. Gary? I asked. Now what? He mumbled. I was wondering, why did you, come here? What? To church camp. I mean, you don't go to church or Sunday school or anything like that, do you? There was a long pause. Finally, he answered. Dale paid my way. Dale? I couldn't hide the surprise in my voice. Yeah, he swings by every once in a while to see how Mom and me are doing. Oh, I said, trying to sound matter-of-fact, but my mind began to race. So Dale already knew this guy. So Dale saw something in him, too. So Dale was actually trying to help. An hour later, Gary and the rest of the camp were sound asleep, but my mind still hadn't shut down. Since there was no way to find the off switch, and since I was still thinking about Gary, I finally sat up and took a good look at him. There he was, curled into a little ball under my one thin blanket. It was funny, but asleep like that, he didn't look so tough or mean. In fact, he kind of looked helpless. He also looked cold, real cold. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and immediately found out why he looked so cold. It was cold. It was freezing. I reached over to my backpack and quickly slipped on a coat and a pair of long johns Mom had packed. Packing thermal underwear in the middle of summer may seem strange, but then again, you don't know Mom. Next, I unzipped my sleeping bag all the way around to make it flat like a blanket. Finally, I got to my feet and carried the flattened bag over to Gary. I looked down at him a moment. He seemed even smaller and more helpless than before. Gently, I laid the bag across him. He stirred a little, but didn't wake up. Good. I glanced over to where Wall Street was sleeping. For a second, I thought of waking her up and scoring about a zillion points, for being such a good deed doer. But somehow, I don't know. I guess somehow I knew this deed should be on the house. Imagine my surprise when I turned and saw Dale standing beside me. In his hand was an extra sleeping bag. I thought you might need this, he said, handing it to me. Then, before I could answer, he turned and headed back to his tent. Talk about amazement. I tell you, the guy never seemed to run out of surprises. That's it for Chapter 8. Chapter 9 will be Danger. Big time. So until next time, have a good day, guys.